All right, hello everyone, and welcome to a video looking into kind of like some past exam and exam style questions for budgetary policy, which hopefully you'll be around the point where you're going to do a SAC on that soon. So I figured we should go through it and look at kind of where I would see the mark breakdowns and a few questions and some sample answers for them to kind of help you be able to structure your answers in a simpler way as possible so you don't lose out on any marks. As you can tell, this is pretty recent, seeing as we are now doing face coverings and stuff at school. So let's get straight into it. So this is a question I made up based on the announcements yesterday about what the budget deficit will be for 2021. So if we had a question that was discussed why the government's budget deficit has increased to 184.5 billion in the 2020 to 2021 financial year. Discussed question is probably going to be worth about 4 marks, and discussed is always going to be either strengths and weaknesses, advantages, disadvantages, or multiple different effects. And so with this kind of question for the 4 marks, I'd kind of be expecting that for 1 mark, you'd explain what a budget deficit is. So the fact that when you're in a budget deficit, the government outlays exceed the government revenues. And then you'd really need to get into what that would mean and why the deficit has increased. So, and explain how revenues for the government have been affected in the current financial year and why that has decreased so much. And then also the same for government outlays. So why government outlays have increased so much and giving a really good reason for that. So kind of explain why they have increased in different ways. So let's get into what a sample for that would look like. So first up, getting that first mark for defining what a budget deficit is. So a budget deficit is a situation where government outlays are greater than the level of government receipts or revenues, depending on what you want to say, which is used to stimulate aggregate demand in times of contraction or falling, stimulate the economy in times of contraction or falling aggregate demand. So that's your first mark there. Bang, all good. So then we get into talking about our revenues and outlays. So one reason why the government's budget deficit has increased to 184.5 billion in 2020-21 is because of the falling taxation revenue received by the government through both company and personal income tax due to decreased spending and increased unemployment caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's your next 1.5. You could go into a little bit more detail there if you wanted to, but you don't really need to. You could probably drop the fact that there's some different information out there about the government receiving $25 billion less in company tax or $37.1 million less in company tax. But the important thing is that you're acknowledging that both receipts from company tax and personal income tax are decreasing because of the decreased spending in the economy and the increased unemployment, therefore less taxes being paid. Then to get into our outlays, so another reason why the government's budget deficit has increased is due to the large increase in outlays required to stimulate the economy during the pandemic, an increase in the levels of transfer payments via welfare due to the increased levels of unemployment. So if you get your next marks there, you could go into a little bit more again. So you could give some examples of increasing outlays. So for example, there's been an increase in defense spending, which is an example of that. Or you could specifically say welfare through the job seeker program and doubling the welfare. But in terms of this, just directly saying why the deficit has increased, that's getting to that point straight away. It's very, very clear because what this question cares about is why revenues and outlays have changed. Then to get into a real VCAR exam question, and to talk about the other one briefly, the reason I included that one before is that if I was to write an exam, I would probably include something like that because it's really going to test students like being able to understand multiple flows and why the current economy is the way that it is. So from a past exam last year, question 3B was select one example of a budgetary policy automatic stabilizer and describe how it operates to stimulate aggregate demand and economic growth. So we're going to look at the mark allocation for this. We're going to look at VCAR's sample answer, and then one that I've made up because I feel like VCAR's sample answer goes in a way that not a lot of students would have gone in, and there's an easier flow of logic that would get you full marks. So you get 1 mark for defining what an automatic stabilizer is, 1 mark for choosing a specific example of an automatic stabilizer, so either tax revenue or transfer payments, and 1 mark for how it impacts the components of aggregate demand and aggregate demand overall. So for example, saying how that would impact consumption spending, and then how that would then affect aggregate demand overall, and then how it impacts production and economic growth. So we'll look at VCAR's answer. So VCAR said automatic stabilizers in relation to budgetary policy are changes to the budget that occur automatically with changes in the level of automatic activity and economic activity, and they work to counter-cyclically boost or slow aggregate demand without deliberate, discretionary, or structural intervention by the government. One of the really, really important parts there is the word counter-cyclically. That's a really, really great thing to have in any definition of automatic stabilizers. You could probably cut out some of these other words, like so things like you could probably just say without any deliberate intervention by the government and not have those next two things because that's just adding words for no reason. But that counter-cyclical is really important because your automatic stabilizers are always trying to like move down the peaks or lift up the troughs in any kind of cyclical flows in the business cycle. It's trying to get them back to that long-term trend line. So an example of an automatic stabilizer is income taxes. For example, during a downturn, personal income tax revenues tend to decrease due to rising unemployment. The government collects less tax revenue. Lower tax revenues tend to push the budget outcome into a reduced surplus or increased deficit. And this budget outcome, therefore, automatically has an expansionary effect on the level of economic activity, resulting in increased consumption spending, and which increases aggregate demand. And this helps stimulate production, resulting in increased rates of economic and employment growth. So I don't love this answer from VCAR, partly because it says, talks about personal income tax revenues tend to decrease due to rising unemployment. And then talks about, goes from that, so there's less tax revenue, meaning there's going to be a deficit, which makes sense, it's all logical. But then the point about it being automatically expansionary and increases consumption spending and aggregate demand doesn't really flow well from the fact that people, like the government's collecting less tax, because if people are becoming employed, they don't have an income, so why would they spend more? The logic's there, because if you look at, but you're going to look at it probably from more the angle that we're going to look at in the next sample, because I feel like the second half of this answer is really talking about the fact that consumption spending increases because as people stop paying tax, they get welfare. But this doesn't say that. It's just saying people pay less tax, therefore they spend more. And the logic is correct, but it's just, I don't know. I don't feel like it's great. So let's look at what I think would be a better answer, because apparently today I'm very critical of VCAR. So sample answer, stealing VCAR's definition because why do extra work? Automatic stabilizers, blah, 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 the same. But then we get into an example of an automatic stabilizer is government outlays on transfer payments through welfare. As people begin to lose their jobs or unemployment begins to increase in an economic downturn or contraction, they can begin to receive transfer payments through welfare, which automatically works to provide an income to those currently unemployed. This maintains or increases private consumption spending, which stimulates aggregate demand. The overall increase in aggregate demand sends a signal to businesses to increase their overall levels of production, which then leads to an increase in the rate of economic growth. So we've got our 4 marks here. So we define automatic stabilizers. We give an example of an automatic stabilizer. Then we explain how that would affect the components of aggregate demand, and then how it would affect production and economic growth. That's your 4 marks there. I feel like this logically flows better than talking about the personal income tax example. Because it's more logically points out people have more money because they're getting welfare payments that they wouldn't have had if they didn't get the welfare payments when they become unemployed. They can use that for consumption spending, which can then increase aggregate demand and production overall. So in any kind of automatic stabilizer question, if you're talking about stimulating the economy, I'd probably go with welfare. If you want to talk about slowing things down in an expansion and working countercyclically there, collecting more tax revenue is a good example of that because it can slow down spending. So that's the logic I'd go with. Hopefully that makes sense to you. But I feel like that's a lot easier to go with. Last thing we're going to look at is the 2018 exam. The Australian government has run a number of budget deficits in recent years and outlined 2 options available to the government when deciding how to finance a budget. So apparently this was done really poorly in 2018. And so this is 2 lots of 2 marks here. So one for identifying a correct way of financing a budget and one for outlining what that option is. Each thing. So there's 3 main options that you should talk about based on the theory that we do based on the key knowledge. So selling bonds to the RBA, selling bonds to the Australian public, and selling bonds to overseas investors. If we look at the sample answer for this one method available to the government for financing a budget deficit is selling bonds to the RBA. This is where the government borrows money from the RBA, which can remove cash from the money supply and put upward pressure on interest rates. Another method available for financing a budget deficit is selling bonds to the Australian public. This is the most common form of financing a budget deficit, as it keeps finances within Australia while helping stimulate the economy. All there really is to it. There's not a lot to this question. It's just like saying what something is and outlining a little bit extra about it. It's pretty simple overall. But yeah, these have been a few different examples of basically some exam style questions with budgetary policy and how you can apply things to them overall. One thing I would definitely say to watch out for, which hasn't been in these questions, is if any question about budgetary policy says the effect on the goal of full employment, goal of low inflation, goal of stable economic growth. Be really wary of that. Anytime it says the goal of, you should define that goal. And it's always really important to have the definition and the measurement within that goal to get the full marks there. We haven't really had anything here about discretionary changes by the government. So anytime that says provide one example of a recent discretionary change, it's got to be a deliberate policy change by the government. At the moment, I believe almost everyone's going to use job seeker for any question like that because it's so easy to tie into any of the goals. But yeah, other than that, if there's anything along these lines that you'd like more help with, let me know. I'm more than happy to do more of it. If you'd like more help with multiple choice, let me know as well, because I'm happy to make up something around that. And we can look at the strategy of how to answer VCAL multiple choice questions, because some of them can be tricky. Other than that, I hope you have an excellent day. Good luck for any assessments coming up. And I will see you next time, where we'll probably do similar for monetary policy. Have a great day. Goodbye.